Welcome to the MAPS Canada webinar series. My name is Shannon Smedella, and I'm your host for the series. We are extremely excited to have you join us for our 7th episode of our webinar series. We are officially halfway done. Since the beginning of June and continuing through to the end of August, we have had and will have amazing selection of speakers, luminaries, scientists, doctors, and visionaries lined up just for you. We've gathered some of the best in the field, 7 additional speakers to be exact, to share important information and their take on the psychedelic renaissance. We are in the middle of the psychedelic renaissance, with research projects and decriminalization proposals popping up across North America, and with MDMA on the verge of approval as a treatment for PTSD, psychedelic therapy is on track to become the next major breakthrough in mental health care. MAPS Canada, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, has supported studies to develop psychedelics into safe and legal medical treatments since its formation in 2008. Currently, MAPS Canada is funding 2 separate studies on MDMA and cognitive processing therapy as a treatment for PTSD. Additionally, plans to fund studies that identify psychedelic treatments for eating disorders and others that involve ibogaine are in the works. To conduct and publish scientific research and education supporting the beneficial use of psychedelic medicines, MAPS Canada relies on public donations and fundraising initiatives. The funds raised from this webinar series go to fund this research. For more information on MAPS Canada, please visit the website at mapscanada.org. So some housekeeping items for today. We will start with our talk from our guest, Erika Dyck, who is joining us. After that, we will start our Q&A session. So as you can see at the bottom of the screen, we have Ask a Question. Please click the button, submit your question, and feel free to vote up your questions as well. And don't be shy to post in the chat. Let us know where you're from. So far, we have some people from Ontario, Lake of the Woods. We have Sunshine Coast, Ottawa, Los Angeles, Germany, Montreal, Vancouver, West Hollywood, Horseshoe Bay, Ottawa, Coast Salish Sea, and again from Vancouver. So make sure and tell us where you're from today so we can see where everyone is tuning in from. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Erika Dyck. Erika Dyck is a professor and historian of medicine at the University of Saskatchewan, who has been studying and writing about psychedelics for the past 15 years. Her work has been widely featured on radio, television, and print media, and she has been featured on a number of documentary films on the topic. She is the author and editor of 7 scholarly books, including Psychedelic Psychiatry, LSD from Clinic to Campus, Johns Hopkins, 2008, University of Manitoba Press, 2011, Facing Eugenics, Reproduction, Sterilization, and the Politics of Choice, University of Toronto, 2013, which was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award for Canadian Nonfiction, and Managing Madness, the Weyburn Mental Hospital and the Transformation of Psychiatric Care in Canada, University of Manitoba Press, 2017, which won the Canadian Historical Association Prize for Best Book in Prairie History. She is the editor of Culture's Catalyst, Historical Encounters with Peyote and the Native American Church in Canada, 2016, and co-editor of Psychedelic Prophets, the Letters of Aldous Huxley, and Humphry, Osmond, 2018. So our topic today, the intersections of psychedelic renaissance and the Me Too movement, has reinforced a need to consider how women have fit into a history of psychedelic discovery, caretaking, and even abuse. The idea of psychedelic privilege and the gendered nature of caretaking has affected our historical understandings of psychedelics and the role of women in that history. This episode looks at the historical participation of women as wives to psychedelic practitioners, as caretakers in the therapeutic setting, and as patients or subjects to consider how gender has affected our understanding of discovery as well as trauma and healing. Please help me welcome Erika Dyck.
Thank you, Shannon. My microphone working now?
Sounds great.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for that really, really flattering introduction. I'm really grateful to be here, and I'm just so glad to be part of this conversation today and with all of these wonderful webinars that have been taking place. Shout out to everyone who's joining in today, and I hope that there'll be some time for question and answers a little bit later. So I'm going to try to share my screen and then get started. All right. Okay. So thanks to everyone for making this possible. I'm really excited to be here and be part of this ongoing conversation. And I want to start by just acknowledging some of the many people who I've worked with over the last few years, particularly people who had played minor roles, we might think, typing out handwriting for archival documents, helping to organize meetings with psychedelic enthusiasts, helping to coordinate different relationships and networks of people working together. I also want to acknowledge the support that I've received for some of the work that I'll talk about today from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and also from the Digital Research Center at the University of Saskatchewan, and especially John Bath, who's helped me to create some databases to help track some of the experiences, and I'll talk a little bit about those today. I've got a few photographs in here as well, where they're specifically from people who've donated them to me. I've acknowledged them here, and if you have any questions, please send me an email, or you can put something in the chat as well. All right, so I want to also thank MAPS for bringing some attention to this issue of women in the history of psychedelics. If you haven't already seen it, you may want to look at the Women in Psychedelics special issue that was put out in 2019. And Maria Mangini has a specific article here on women in the history of psychedelics, and I encourage you to take a look at this. And I hope that we can explore this conversation a little bit more and building on some of that work. And I'm excited to share this with you today. So, as you all know, psychedelics have a long and colorful history, and the word psychedelic was not officially coined until 1957. And because I'm a historian and a bit of a nerd for finding these exact moments, I've got an image here that I don't expect you all to be able to read, but on the left-hand side is Aldous Huxley's very nicely typed up note to Humphry Osmond, where he recommends the word phanerothine. And you can see how excited how excited Humphry Osmond was. He started making notes on the letter as soon as it had arrived, and he wrote back and suggested the word psychedelic, which you can see about a third of the way down the page on the right-hand side. So we know that this word, this set of experiences, these ideas have really captivated a wide variety of people for a long time. We know, for example, that botanists, psychiatrists, anthropologists, historians had long encountered substances that altered consciousness or produced psychotic-like symptoms. And we know that outside the networks of Western science, plant healers or plant teachers have been part of sacred knowledge systems for even longer. This is a rather staged photo, but it is one where Humphry Osmond, who you can see sort of tucked away in the corner of the picture, is attending a peyote ceremony in 1956. The often consciousness-altering experiences captivated researchers who often attempted to give meaning to these experiences, whether these were in therapeutic encounters or in introspective moments. And beginning at least by the 1920s, but probably much earlier, Western observers began to codify these experiences and search for language and terminology to describe them. So we know, for example, that anthropologists became particularly fascinated with indigenous rituals that had incorporated the consumption of plants that caused spiritual visions, as they described them at the time, while chemists clamored to isolate the chemical or the molecular compounds from such mysterious magical plants or plant healers or plant teachers in order to study the pharmacological properties separated or separately from a ceremonial context. And I think this process of separating the chemical compounds from the plant is as much an act of science as it is an act of culture. Some of the early 20th century accounts, like the one we might see here, helped to bring attention to the plants as well as the experiences, but also participated in a process of altering language and changing the way we talk and learn about these psychoactive substances. Over the course of much of the 20th century, we grew more and more conditioned to trust the voices of scientific authorities over the unscientific, or at least informally educated authorities whose knowledge was rooted in different traditions, or whose authority was more related to experience. This, of course, is not at all unique to psychedelics. I love this image because it actually is taken from the mental hospital in Weyburn where Humphry Osmond was working, where he was sitting when he wrote the word psychedelic. But I think it gives quite a stark image of the sort of power of the medical profession. We know that within the history of medicine, that the medical profession also experienced a similar transition as it moved from an occupation where one's authority or one's ability to ask for fees for services was based on how much experience a physician had. And it was only really after the 1920s that physicians more routinely had formal medical education, that is text-based learning in universities, that began to separate experience from formal education or text-based knowledge. So I want to emphasize this point because I think one of the dominant tensions in the history of psychedelics rests with this notion of experience. Should practitioners have direct experience with psychedelics before recommending their use? Whose experiences do we trust? Those filtered through a Western science model, or those from people who have learned about plant medicines through ritual or observation? This line of questioning, I think, raises a number of key issues with the ongoing debates about the future of psychedelics, but many of these questions also have deep historical roots. And along the historical journey, there are familiar tensions. Who should have access to these experiences? Should they be regulated, liberated? Should they be ritualized, medicalized, commercialized? None of these questions are new, but despite our familiarity with these tensions, we've historically privileged some perspectives over others, and relatedly, we tend to celebrate some contributions over others. And for anyone who participated in some of the recent meetings, the Catalyst Conference in Calgary, for example, some of these themes were playing out there as well in very explicit ways. Maybe you saw the debate on the medicalization versus commercialization as one example. So last year, I participated at the Breaking Convention Conference, which perhaps some of you tuning in were also present at that meeting. And in that meeting, I looked at some of the ways that women's voices have been erased from this history, or at the very least have been overlooked. And I want to revisit some of those examples with you today, but I've also spent the last year since that conference last August, I've been reflecting a little bit more on this topic, and I want to share some new ideas and some what I think are some new and exciting developments as well. I also want to acknowledge that recently Bia Labate at the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines invited me to help coordinate a series on the history of women in psychedelics. And I'm very happy to say that as of today, we are launching that call for papers. And before the official launch, I had started reaching out to a few friends and colleagues just to test this idea, to find out what they thought of the notion of writing about the history of women in psychedelics. And within just a few days, now granted these were my friends, I had 20 authors who had committed to submitting material on this topic. And it was interesting that the topic really strikes a chord with a number of historians and social scientists, again, those ones who I knew, who are motivated to draw attention to what they see as a growing imbalance in who we listen to, or whose experiences we trust or acknowledge, and how this affects the way we think about both our psychedelic past as well as our psychedelic future. In one of the Chacruna articles that had inspired me to look at women in the first place, Ariel Vagosin described the concept of psychedelic privilege, a concept she coined to, in her words, address both the privilege in who has access to psychedelic therapy and the privilege in the context of recreational psychedelic use. The example she uses here is one where white people access indigenous approaches to psychedelics while still benefiting from colonialism, or where white people gain the benefits from both psychedelics and colonialism without working to dismantle racism or colonialism. And I think today, seeing this in the context of what we're seeing around the world in some of the Black Lives Matter movements and many of the social justice movements, I think this is even more poignant perhaps than it was in August 2019. Put in more explicitly gendered terms, Vagosin describes how women perform roles as caretakers for men who go on heroic journeys that are not necessarily available to women who are not afforded the same privilege of feeling safe to relinquish control, particularly in social situations. Her report goes much further into this issue, but I want to pause here and reflect on how this issue or this idea of psychedelic privilege and the gendered nature of caretaking has affected our historical understanding of psychedelics and the role of women in that history. So looking at the way that psychedelic history has been characterized, It is true, and I've participated in this process myself. My own book on psychedelic psychiatry, which I published in 2008, I followed very closely and very enthusiastically. I followed the lives and the discoveries of many of the men involved. And I don't regret that, and I don't think that it was wrong to do so. But I do think that if we ask different questions, we begin to see other players that come into focus. And that's what I want to talk about today. So if we toss out some of the more sensationalist histories that describe psychedelics as dangerous, or part of mind control or CIA exercises, we are beginning to see a number of texts that are helping to shed more positive light on the history of psychedelics. And I'm sure that that's not surprising to this group here. The vast majority of those books do so by emphasizing many of the scientific claims, whether historical or contemporary, and many are concentrating on therapeutic breakthroughs. I think these are really important discoveries, and I think they're very important to emphasize. But in an attempt to reframe our understanding of psychedelics as potentially beneficial, we've also tended to ignore or downplay features of this past that may appear less scientific or maybe less comfortable. And I think at least a significant component of that needs to be explored to a greater degree. So I want to go back to the 1950s and into my historical comfort zone to give a few examples of what I mean by this. So the emphasis on male contributions in the history of psychedelics is in part reflective of a 1950s culture. Men tended to be the main income earners, which is true, but this feature downplays the role of women and undermines some of the significant contributions that they made, not just because they are women, but because they were wives to some of those psychedelic enthusiasts, or because they participated directly in a research environment that at the time blurred the lines about who gets paid for that work. And I don't do this to emphasize a particular heteronormative set of values, but I really want to explain that at times, wives in this context were considered appendages to their husbands' careers. This is not exclusive to psychedelics, of course. But in this case, even more so than nurses or other staff members who may have worked in psychiatric clinics working on psychedelics, wives played a really critical role in the foundations of understanding and describing psychedelic experiences, particularly for people who took it the first time. We also know, if we read through some of those papers, or especially any of the longer dissertations or books and anthologies from this period, almost invariably there is a thanks to a wife, usually the woman who literally typed up the manuscript on a typewriter, but also the woman who brought the coffee, made the meals, and brought dinners to where people came together to try psychedelics in a more, we might say, recreational context, but with serious intent in people's homes. I want to give a few examples then, and I'll try to do this quickly, but you'll forgive me if I've come to really appreciate some of these people and their relationships, and I may elaborate a little bit. So Rose and Abram Hoffer. The Hoffers were deeply involved in psychedelic trials in Canada, and I interviewed Abe in 2002. His wife Rose had already died by the time that I interviewed him, but he remembered very tenderly how the first time he took LSD, he became a bit paranoid. He turned to his wife and he confided in her, and it was she who nurtured him through his first experience, which launched him onto this path of research. June Blewett, here pictured with her husband, Duncan Blewett, was a graduate student in psychology at the University of Regina, and Duncan Blewett was a founding professor in the department. So the relationship was on the surface a bit scandalous, but that quickly passed. And not only did June volunteer for early trials, but she became a coveted and a creative force in the lab, working closely with Duncan, proofreading his papers, and later helping to organize political campaigns as these two lobbied the Canadian government for retained access to psychedelics throughout the 1960s, and on behalf of a variety of Indigenous groups, particularly in Saskatchewan, but also throughout Western Canada. I'm just giving a few snapshots here. These are not the sum total of their contributions. Jane Osmond begrudgingly moved to the small town of Weyburn, Saskatchewan from London, England in 1951 to support her husband Humphrey's unflinching desire to reform mental hospitals and to engage in research using hallucinogens. So of course, when he came, the word psychedelics was not coined yet. He did that a few years later. And Osmond was almost manic in his passion for this research. He didn't sleep much. He was deeply curious about all people, ideas, cultures, languages, and especially ideas that tested assumptions or conventions. Jane kept him grounded. She made sure he ate, he slept, and she offered a steady ear to his many, I transcribed thousands of pages of his letters. I will just keep saying many ideas about how to bring psychedelics into modern psychiatry. Amy Izumi, in some ways, we could say maybe saved her husband. Her family welcomed a young Kiyoshi, or he later went by Joe, but Kyo or Joe, into their home during the Second World War when Japanese families in several provinces, including his hometown of Vancouver, Japanese families were being interned in internment camps. In Saskatchewan, there were a very small number of Japanese families living in the province, and the government did not find internment to be cost effective, so they allowed Japanese families to keep their homes. So Kiyoshi became not only indebted to Amy's family who took him in, but also later to the Saskatchewan government. After becoming an architect, he took LSD with Amy as they wandered through the halls of the provincial mental hospital. Amy did not enjoy her experience. She became nauseous and upset, but encouraged her husband to try it again. She kept notes, she sketched some of his visual experiences, and she provided gentle support as he imagined LSD-inspired hospital spaces. There are so many rich examples of these kinds. I don't really want to belabor this, but merely to sort of point out a few examples and end, I think, perhaps fittingly, with Aldous Huxley, his first wife, Maria, and then his second wife, Laura. When Maria succumbed to cancer in the late 1950s, Aldous was the one who nursed her through her final days, in the end, giving her LSD to help ease her anxieties about dying. A few years later, his second wife, Laura, who had been a longtime friend of the family, gave Aldous LSD as he too succumbed to the final stages of cancer. Now, there's much more to say about the contributions of these two amazing women than just the features of dying care, but for the sake of time, I want to emphasize here that these examples help remind us of the kinds of caring roles that often can be taken for granted or considered unworthy of inclusion, either in an academic paper or in how we remember what is important about the psychedelic experience. So I want to now turn to another set of examples that come from looking at clinical trials themselves. In this case, I'm looking at the role of women as staff and as patients or subjects. And over the past few years, I've been collecting, digitizing, and transcribing case reports. And by that, I should say, I have not been doing this alone. That long list of people at the beginning of my presentation and a growing list of students and really incredible researchers have been helping with this project. So I certainly cannot take credit for this. Suffice to say, we have digitized a little over 1,000 entries now. They're not all complete case files. And most of them come from the Hollywood Hospital, which is in New Westminster, or was in New Westminster in Vancouver. And the second is from the Weyburn, or the Saskatchewan Mental Hospital at Weyburn, which is the aerial view that I've pictured here. So we've got about 3 different clinics where we're trying to collect patient files from. And in these files, what we're finding is that women represent about 27% of the cases in terms of the gender ratio in subjects, that is, or patients. Of those, about 300 files, of the 300 complete files that we have, only 31 contain written correspondence, either from staff or patients or both. So these are kind of rare findings. I certainly don't want to make a robust statistical argument here. But I think it's important to think about the nature of the way that the records were kept and the way that records were created or generated. And so I'll walk through a couple of examples of that to give some context. I guess I shouldn't get to Al Hubbard yet, but you can bear with me. You can take a look at his photo. The most remarkable parts of these files, I think, come from the patients or subjects themselves. And I'm trying to use those words a bit interchangeably because sometimes people came in seeking a particular therapeutic experience and they came out saying that that wasn't therapy, that was an experience. And so sometimes people challenge the idea of whether or not they were in a patient relationship or whether they were sort of volunteers and subjects. And that's why I'm kind of playing with that language a little bit. In these case files, there are a lot of observers' reports. And so often those observers' reports are typed up by someone who is signed as a Mrs. So-and-so, often not even including the woman's name, but, you know, Mrs. Hubbard, for example. And upon closer examination, those Mrs. So-and-sos often seem to be the wives of some of the key researchers that we know worked in those facilities. It's unclear whether they were ever paid for that work, and that's not really my point here, but I think it goes further to the way that they haven't been acknowledged. In all cases, the people present in these experiences had to have had personal experience with LSD or mescaline before they were allowed to enter the therapeutic setting. They had to be what was described as sort of empathetic observers. And in all of the subsequent reports that were written by patients, and here again, we don't have a complete set, but in the cases where we do have patients or subjects reflecting on their experience, many of them identify the role that was played by the women who were sitting in the room, who were not otherwise listed in the official records. Women, it seemed, played really particular roles in comforting patients, particularly as they went through their own experiences. And I'll give you just one poignant example here as just to flesh this out a little bit. So Ruth Hubbard, who I cannot find a photo of, if someone has a photo, I would love to see it. She is the wife of the rather infamous Al Hubbard. So for any of you who've read Michael Pollan's book, he describes Al Hubbard as the Johnny Appleseed of acid. Al Hubbard appears throughout these files. Mrs. R. Hubbard has her name listed, either she wrote it herself or it's recorded in about 30 cases. And sometimes her name comes through like in the official form, she's typed in as if she was meant to be there. And other times it's a patient remembering what Mrs. Hubbard had done, but she wasn't listed as one of the official people sort of formally recognized in that experiment. What I found really interesting is that reading through some of the historical literature and looking for remnants of what Al Hubbard's contributions were, one of the things that he's kind of known for, amongst many other sort of mysterious qualities about him, whether he worked for the CIA, whether he'd been a CSIS operative, whether he was paid by different secret organizations. There's lots of tall tales about Al Hubbard. Some of them are probably true. I do know for certain that he faked and sort of forged his medical degree. He paid a forgery to have a medical degree so he could get access to LSD. All this to say, I don't think that we should rely on him as our arbiter for truth. However, one of the things associated with Al Hubbard was that he was very, very creative in making adjustments to the set and setting in experimental design. He's allegedly the person who brought in different forms of artwork. Some claim that he was the first person to introduce the rose, which has become a characteristic feature in many therapeutic settings since, even to this day. And also, he's been routinely associated with playing with different acoustics within an experimental setting, particularly bringing in different musical selections to bring patients in and out of certain kinds of experiences or to set a mood, if you will, within the set and setting. And this is still at a time where they're trying to codify some of those features. So it's really, I think it's quite interesting and kind of loose around the edges. What I found, though, was that Ruth Hubbard was actually perhaps more directly involved in making some of these selections. When I read the nurses' reports closely, it appeared that it was Ruth Hubbard, so Al's wife, who managed the record player in several sessions. In some reports, it's not clear whether she's choosing the music, such as in one case when a patient brought in a recording of his own accordion playing. Then he recoiled in frustration, saying he didn't want to hear it because this music was terrible and he felt ashamed. Mrs. Hubbard replaced the recording with Bach, and the patient declared that he felt subdued. And this is in his own words the next day. This is a case from 1960, I should add. Another male patient began his experience with a lot of apprehension, and Mrs. Hubbard appears this time only in the nurse's notes, indicating that Mrs. H was present at the beginning of the experience. But during the experience, the patient grew agitated and asked the staff to leave. Someone, perhaps Ruth Hubbard, recorded that two doctors, Al Hubbard and D.C. McDonald, left the room. Then, the notes simply say, music, immortal love songs of Montevani. Note the passive voice that literally erases the presence of someone in the room, likely Ruth. She must have been there to put on the selection, and there is no indication that she left the room. The notes go on to describe that the patient grew quiet, but stabilized his breathing and stopped perspiring. Now, in this case, with only one person left in the room with the patient, patients were never left alone. Ruth was likely the one who kept the notes, as well as changed the music. And she later relayed this information to the two doctors, including her husband, not really a doctor, who sat outside the room for the remainder of the experiment. In the very next experiment that was done at that clinic, Mrs. Ruth Hubbard's role changed on the form. They crossed out observer and put music beside her name. This was now setting the tone for the next session. Now, to me, this suggests more than someone who is merely turning a dial or flipping a switch, but perhaps making real decisions about the musical selections, a feature that is more often associated with her rather famous husband, who became well known for refining and even perfecting the set and setting, especially around the music. Now, we also know that in addition to Ruth Hubbard's participation, women like Helen Bonney played a critical role in pioneering some of the theoretical justifications for musical selections in psychedelic sessions in the 1960s. Bonney is the subject of a recent PhD thesis by Stephen Lett, who defended it at the University of Michigan recently. Her Wikipedia entry, this is not a criticism of Lett, by the way, her Wikipedia entry is only a handful of sentences, most of which describe the significant people who influenced her work, and none credit her with influencing psychedelic therapy. Now, we might quickly fix this by simply rewriting her Wikipedia page, but my point here is that I think sometimes the way we think about these historical moments, we could do a better job of acknowledging people today. So these tiny fragments of women's participation may seem inconsequential, but I am going to try to convince you that they are worthy of more attention. Not only does it help show some of the important ways that women participated in these experiments, but it also reminds us how they influenced those experiments in subtle but significant ways. Now, as a historian attempting to reconstruct their roles, it seemed clear to me that in some ways, women's participation had literally been rendered invisible, making it difficult to find them in documentary evidence. Say, for example, if we only looked at that file about Ruth Hubbard and I hadn't looked at the files on either side, I probably wouldn't even know that she had been present. But if we can try to find them, we may see ways that, we may see how their participation has been obscured or distorted. But I want to add, I'm absolutely inspired by the response from scholars, students, and activists who are participating in rewriting this history amidst the psychedelic renaissance. Over the past year, reaching out to scholars working on this history, we've been finding all sorts of similar stories. Dutch nurses performed roles remarkably and unsurprisingly similar to the ones that I found in Canada, providing critical caregiving, note-taking, and might have later been what we might later call integrating people in integrative sessions. In historian Stephen Snelder's research, he found that none of these nurses were named in any of the published reports in the Dutch literature. I'm just giving a few snapshots here as well. PhD student Vincent Verreau has verified that psychiatrist Anne-Marie Caten conducted the first psilocybin trials in France in the early 1950s, but she was not the first one to get her work published and has since been more or less forgotten. Zoe Dubuque, also doing her doctoral research in France, has identified a number of really interesting, fascinating women who are working as psychoanalysts using LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin in the early 1950s. She showed that these women are part of a European network of researchers and therapists. And in her case, many of the women were describing the importance of setting, as well as articulating what we might say, I'm trying to translate from her French, and my French is not good enough, but she describes how they engage in a process of working with each other to help describe the emotional state of the patient. And they saw this as key to successful therapy. So while Timothy Leary has been credited with the concept of set and setting, Zoe is helping to challenge some of that research by showing that he is certainly not alone. It's women like Joyce Martin and Margot Kuttner who also recognized these features and had communicated with people like Sidney Cohen through their feminist or women's networks with people like Betty Eisner. This kind of work, I think, suggests that in addition to psychedelic networks, there may have been another layer of women's networks that also shared information about psychedelics, as well as some of the personalities involved in that research. Women are an important subject for this research, but of course it's not just about women per se. One of the other contributions, and I should say this is just starting, so I'm only kind of getting a snapshot of a few of them. Another set of research has been focused around Indigenous midwives in Mexico who used a carefully coordinated strategy of breathwork and ergot, so what LSD is synthesized from, to help women through varying stages of childbirth or to help them procure abortions. History professor and Latin American specialist Nora Jaffrey stumbled onto this recognition as she tried to retrace the legal fate of women who were being persecuted for seeking abortions. Now, most of these women are not named in the court documents, but their use of ergot and the attempted abortions led, in some cases, to their death or imprisonment. So it's for good reason that they kept this knowledge secret. There were high stakes here. But it also means that other kinds of experiences have not been included in our collective understanding of this history, or maybe we haven't looked in the right places. I find this connection quite fascinating myself as well. Over 100 years after those abortion trials that Nora Jaffray uncovered, on a small farm in Kansas, a group of radical midwives, as they called themselves, set up a cooperative space for supporting women through natural childbirth. This was done in the 1960s and into the 70s more specifically. They adopted Stan Grof's holotropic breathwork techniques to guide them through their practice. Historian Wendy Klein has found through interviews that many of the founding women in this group attributed their approach to Grof, but due to the politics surrounding psychedelics and Grof's association with that controversial past in the early 1970s, they had not used his name in their literature describing the breathwork techniques. Here again, the characterization of the past reveals a broken chain of influence, and it distorts our understanding of what happened or who might benefit from renewing these relationships. Finally, I want to go on all day, but I want to hear your questions as well. A PhD student at Purdue University, Andrea Enns, has found that contrary to some of the historical literature that condemns the use of psychedelic drugs in what amounted to sexual conversion therapy, Enns tracked down patients that told a very different story. In her master's thesis, Andrea Enns discovered that while some people expressly sought out LSD treatments for same-sex attraction, remember, homosexuality during this period was considered illegal and a disorder according to the Diagnostic Statistics Manual, or DSM. But the majority of the people she found in her admittedly small sample found that there were no attempts at conversion in the psychedelic trials. The characterization of the drug trials was produced during a moral panic that equated psychedelics with bad science, when claims from patients themselves, in this case, patients were described as patients, the patients themselves rejected that idea and argued that the LSD helped them to learn how to love themselves, how to see themselves, and how to reconcile relationships with either their wives, their neighbors. They're very moving accounts, actually. You could read about it in her thesis, which is available online. Now, we have limited data from those particular cases, and Andrea could not find anyone to interview who had been treated nearly 70 years ago. But there were 0 cases that described by either the patients or the psychiatrists of attempts to convert someone's sexuality or to have them, become heterosexual. Enns argues that despite the importance of LSD to their therapy, the politicization of psychedelics during this period made it difficult to publicly admit to having taken these drugs, even though the period also coincides with significant changes in the medical and legal characterization of homosexuality as criminalized or medicalized. The fear of admitting to having taken LSD in the early 1970s was more risky, according to the men who participated in these trials. There were a few women who participated as well, but the focus on this, that particular thesis is on men. So I hope that I've convinced you, or at least some of you, that Women in the History of Psychedelics is just one pathway for uncovering hidden or buried stories about the history of psychedelics that is relevant, I think, to how we proceed today along a path of decriminalization. Other scholars are much more qualified to talk about the role of Indigenous healing, ritual, spirituality, and the ways of knowing plant teachers. And I think there are some similarities in how that history has been silenced at times to protect a certain version of psychedelic history that seems to help justify our current desires to bring these substances back into the mainstream. And this is important. My critique here is not about whether psychedelics should be part of mainstream healing, but it is about what kinds of stories we tell ourselves or which voices we trust in order to build the kind of psychedelic future that we want. The relaxing of laws and regulations regarding clinical trials is not just good for science and therapy. It means that new sources are being released, new voices are coming forward to reconcile this past, as well as the many different and diverse participants who have contributed to this history. There are lessons we might learn about how to conduct ourselves in clinical trials, or how to approach regulators about randomized controlled trials, but I think we also have an opportunity to think about the cultural impact of this movement. We might take this opportunity to do a better job of acknowledging the contributions of people in this movement, past and present. So taking cues from Ariel Vigoson's suggestion that we need to link psychedelic work with social justice, we might try to confront the politics of psychedelic privilege. We might reflect on what else has been erased from this history, or that which has been embellished or altered in an effort to present a story of cohesion and progress that helps to justify our current model or desire for mainstreaming psychedelics. We might pay closer attention to which stories have been buried or forgotten to protect people's reputations, or what that means for how we can learn from our mistakes. Thank you all for tuning in. And I want to also remind you that if any of you feel that you have something to share in this domain, I encourage you to get in touch with me. I'd love to work with a variety of people to get some more information about women in the history of psychedelics. And women is just the beginning, but it's one of our places for starting. So I thought it would be fitting here to end with Laura Huxley. And just thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Erika.
Thanks.
All right, so we have some questions from our viewers here that we'll go through. And I just want to, again, thank you for the valuable information and for all of the important work and research that you're doing. So let's go to our first question from Crowdcast, and it's from Amy. And the question is, can you recommend a few of your favorite modern women psychedelic researchers that we should be following right now?
There are some amazing people working on this topic. I hope that if I say a few, I will forget really wonderful ones. If you send me an email, I can give you a more complete list. But I would encourage you to go and look at the Chacruna Institute. They've got a great sort of library of resources there, and there are a variety of people participating in these kinds of conversations. There's new work out. Wendy Klein just published an article about women in psychedelics, and she's one of the ones who's been working on those midwives as well. There's some really fascinating stuff coming out in non-English texts as well, and I'm slower to pick up on that as I'm fairly Anglo myself, but working together with junior researchers, I think there's a really promising future here. Daniel Gifford has a new book out on acid revival. There's some, yeah, I'll miss people if I try to do a complete list.
No problem. I have another question here that is not from Crowdcast, but it is, what can we do in the psychedelic community to ensure women leaders and researchers are not downplayed going forward?
Yeah, I mean, sitting in the comfort of my home, but knowing what's going on with COVID right now and all the kind of social justice conversations that are taking place in the wake of all sorts of brutality and all sorts of fear. I think these are really poignant conversations, and they're complicated. I certainly don't think there's a one fixed solution, like make sure you have a woman invited, but you know, we should be consciously making an effort to bring diversity to the table. And it's not just women. I want to stress that, you know, this presentation is about women's roles, but it's really about diversity and really thinking carefully about what kind of privileges we are taking for granted, what kinds of voices we're privileging. If we only have scientists at the table, are we missing a piece of the cultural component? The same way that if we only have men at the table, are we missing a piece of what I saw historically, at least, was some of the ways that people were articulating emotional caregiving in ways that didn't make it into papers, but were clearly part of the conversation inside and outside of the clinic. So just as an example, I think being conscious about diversity and really making an effort to think through, you know, what that means and what perspectives we're missing when we don't have a variety of people at the table, and embrace that kind of the conflict that comes with that, you know, that we have to sometimes lean into that conflict.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So how can learning about the history of psychedelic science inform us of how it should be conducted now?
So yeah, I've spent 15 years trying to answer that question. So yeah, I mean, I'm a historian, so I'm looking in the rearview mirror sort of wherever I go, I feel. But I don't mean to be glib about it either. I think that there are many things that we can see that are different about the past, but there are some things that are really quite similar. And if we take it seriously and not just sort of caricature the past or take sort of a superficial reading of it, we see a lot of very passionate people engaged in some of the questions that we're still struggling with today. And I think there's something quite humanizing about that, or actually quite comforting. Questions about regulation, questions about commercialization, and there were different contexts for sure. But I think there's some of the same. Some of them are existential questions, some of them are philosophical, but some of them are brass tacks economics, and really thinking through the politics of psychedelics. And I'm not yet convinced, although again, I look in the rearview mirror often, so perhaps I've missed it, but I'm not convinced that we've come to some kind of consensus or some comfortable place about what we want collectively a psychedelic future to look like. So I think looking to the past is a way of helping to keep some diversity and some perspective. People who were living during the Cold War, who were concerned about nuclear bombs, were also worried about anxiety. We have different anxieties, so we might describe the causes of them in different ways, but I think there are still some sort of deeply rooted cultural anxieties about racism, about annihilation, COVID being a good example of, fears of things we can't really control. And I think there's a lot to be taken from looking back.
Mm-hmm. Speaking about going into the past and your over 15 years of research, did your interest in the history of medicine start with psychedelics, or was that something that you discovered along the way?
Apologies to anyone who's heard me answer this before. It's a very boring answer. I wasn't drawn to this for the psychedelics per se. I became enthralled with the psychedelics, but my initial foray into this was really through politics. I was very interested in what kind of medical research was being done in a place that was championing, or at least attempting to bring forward a publicly funded healthcare system. So in Saskatchewan, where doctors had sort of hemorrhaged out of the province for a while, the newly elected government that campaigned on a promise of Medicare, actively sought out researchers who were not going to just sort of fit in the status quo, but who had creative solutions, or who were willing to invest in research that would help us think outside the box. And I think it's partly that way of thinking that also then coupled with an idea that we wanted to invest in a healthcare system that was both accessible, but also made some economic sense. So investing in a therapy that could be, perhaps at least at the time, described as a one-time therapy with follow-up psychotherapy was much, much cheaper than putting people, for example, in asylums or in mental hospitals for the rest of their lives. And so I think the economics and the politics that surrounded the promise of psychedelics in the first place, that was partly what got me interested in it. Was like, how could they square this? What seemed like a conservative place, or at least a socially conservative place, or what seemed like a place that wasn't Vancouver or Montreal or Toronto or Los Angeles or San Francisco. This was Weyburn, Saskatchewan, which, were it not for psychedelics, might not have ever made the map. So it was I was trying to square that circle and try to understand why this particular place was able to sustain that kind of research for this period. And partly it's the personalities for sure, but I think there was a deep desire for a sort of political commitment to seeing psychedelics as they fit with a model for maybe a made in Canada healthcare solution. Mm-hmm. I can say that for the MAPS Canada site, right?
In regards to Canada and controlled substances and politics, when psychedelics became controlled substances in Canada, were we largely just following suit from the US, or how did that?
I think it's a complicated relationship. As Canada's relationship with the United States is always complicated, and there's always a little bit more than meets the eye. So in some ways, yes. I mean, Canadian regulators were concerned about what was going on in the United States, but Canadian regulators also retained access to LSD and mescaline at the time for longer than many of the states did. Now, California closed down operations in 1966, but Maryland allowed for research to continue for longer. So partly it's that there were state-by-state regulations in the United States that make it difficult to compare. Health Canada had made certain declarations, but they also allowed for researchers to gain access to LSD or to continue using their stores of LSD for longer if they could prove that they had sort of bona fide research. One of the ways, though, that I think this gets more complicated is we can follow the policy lines and we can see subtle differences. But one of the challenges was that when they were looking for naive volunteers or naive drug users for their controls, they have found it incredibly difficult to find people who weren't influenced by media, much of which was American media. And this isn't to blame America, but that's where we start to see the border really becoming much more fluid. And so people who were volunteering for trials or people who were seeking out therapy were often responding to something they saw in a non-Canadian venue and hoping that they could find something equivalent in Canada. As you start to see kind of a clashing of those different ideals. So I think on the cultural level, yes, there's a mashing of the Canadian and American examples.
Okay.
And it's interesting to see what happens in current policy. I would love to see Canada embrace pharmacare writ large, but I'd love to see psychedelics as part of a Canadian pharmacare solution, which would continue along this kind of historical path of bringing psychedelics into an alignment with the kind of values that we have invested in our healthcare system here today.
Absolutely. It definitely will be interesting to see what happens going forward. What is your experience of the current research community surrounding psychedelics? It appears well over half male, but is it at all unfriendly to women starting a career in psychedelic research?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I'm well positioned to answer that. I mean, I've been working as a historian in this, so I am not attempting to get positions in labs. I've met with people and I have sort of anecdotal interviews with people, whatnot. But I don't know what it's like. I think, there's lots of statistics about women in STEM, top STEM areas in general, science, technology, engineering, medicine. So I think there are some of those regular barriers or those kinds of barriers that we see outside of psychedelics more broadly. And within psychedelics, I would like to think that we're more open to these, but we have seen a lot of examples over the years, and this continues to be a conversation that keeps coming back. So I'm not sure, I don't want to pick on the psychedelic field as though it's separate from all these other fields, but I don't think we have made dramatic inroads or that we are necessarily more enlightened or moving forward beyond what's happening in some of the other fields where we still see systemic barriers with women in these occupations in these areas of research.
Okay, thank you. The next one comes from Dave on Crowdcast here, and he's asking if you've talked with Anne Shulgin about her experience and role in helping discover new psychedelic and empathogenic compounds.
I've not spoken with her directly. I know that people have been doing research on this. One of my goals with this project that literally we launched today, so it sounds like it's more done than it is. It's just starting. One of my goals is to first sort of reach out and find out who's already working on things, because I don't want to swoop in and talk about people. I've found some really incredible researchers who are engaged in these projects right now as master's projects or as PhD theses. And I wanted to try to highlight that and really encourage, developing another generation of scholars who are asking these critical questions, and hopefully give people a chance to find their own words to describe this first before I swoop in. I welcome any suggestions, and I really want to encourage this conversation. So thanks for the suggestion. She's certainly somebody who's on my list as someone I'm looking for. I know there are a few women who have a little bit more higher profile, and I'm really encouraged seeing, like, even within the last 5 years, there have been a number of graduate projects, and it doesn't all have to be academic, but that's just been one of my search mechanisms, is using, looking through dissertations to see who's been written about. So people like Betty Eisner or Helen Bonney have recent dissertations on them, which is really exciting to me. And maybe that's true of Anne Shulgin as well. I wouldn't be surprised.
The next one here is, again, on Crowdcast, and Stephanie's asking if you know if these influential women in history were friends with each other.
Yeah, there's a wonderful article, not at all about psychedelics, but about, the way women gossip, and why this is a really important way of thinking about doing historical research. And at first I thought it was kind of, cute, but it's really got me thinking a bit more about how to tap into some of these networks that were either written off as like, women hanging out talking about women's stuff or gossiping even, and how that was sort of written off. And yet there's really interesting information there. And sometimes gossip kind of maybe gets a bad, has sort of a negative implication. But sometimes sharing information, which Zoe Dubuque's work is showing, I think, really clearly, that women were talking with each other. And sometimes that was to share information about how to get a good emotional response in a therapeutic session. But sometimes it was, look out for these guys. They're known for example, I think she pointed out, it may not have been Zoe who said this, I don't want to misattribute it. Somebody pointed out that Artie Lang in Glasgow was, mostly men who were involved in his experiments, and they weren't really friendly to women. And so this is a really interesting example of, there were women who were sharing that kind of information and knowledge, and sometimes it may have been for kind of protective reasons, and other times it may have been to enhance a kind of therapeutic experience, like the integration model that Joyce Martin talks about. So I do think that maybe if we can attune our research to taking gossip seriously, or maybe not using that word gossip, but thinking about the ways in which women are connecting with one another, that might be a really useful way to get at this. It's hard to find that. I mean, we may have letters in some cases. I have found some letters amongst women, and certainly it's clear from reading men's correspondence that their wives are also present at many of the meetings. So Aldous Huxley and Humphry Osmond, those are two sets of letters that I've gone through quite closely. It's very, very clear that their wives are close friends, and they exchange little notes in the margins of the letters sometimes. So there's little clues that that's probably the case. So this is something that, I can't recreate that historically, but it's something that we could pay closer attention to today, for example, rather than writing something off as gossip, but thinking about, what kind of networks do exist, formally and informally, and paying attention to some of those, some of the networks.
Absolutely. And on that topic, and you've already touched on this a little bit as well, were women included in the early clinical trials in the 50s and 60s? How about women of color? And were they treated differently than their male counterparts?
In the trials that I've looked at, I cannot verify. So I can't verify very much in terms of race. I can make some estimated guesses, but I don't have a lot of information to go by. Even in the trials themselves, in cases where race, sometimes nationality, sometimes ethnicity is listed, and these categories are they're not super clear. I mean, we know they're not clear today, but it's not even clear who's filling out the form, whether it's the individual themselves or whether someone is making a superficial judgment. So I think it's really problematic to kind of read back and find people who don't self-identify. That being said, so with that caveat, there are some women who definitely participate and are acknowledged and are included on published reports for sure. But there are a lot who are not. So I know that there are many, many, many more women who are present in those in those therapeutic settings, who are not named and who are not acknowledged. And I don't want this to come across as not, blaming the researchers of the time, but more of a bit of a wake-up call for ourselves to just kind of look around and think about, who we acknowledge when we do the kind of work we do and what kind of labor we consider as valuable for recognition. So that, I think that's more my point there. Historically, the problem with the records is a big one, because for a long time, none of these records, when I started doing my PhD in this topic in the early 2000s, I couldn't gain access to a lot of the records. There was still a lot of stigma around the history of psychedelics, and so there was concern that I was going to out some big state secret or something, and I had difficulty. I went through lots of legal procedures to try to gain access to these, and that's changing. And over the last few years, we're starting to get more access. People are donating their records more willingly. I've had a number of people reach out to me and say, my father was treated this way. Would you like his files? And if those are in someone's basement, there's no way I was going to access that, and certainly no way if someone felt that this was an embarrassing secret in the family. But I think as our understanding of psychedelics is changing in the current culture, it's also changing the ways that we have access to some of these stories. And I think it's a real opportunity to sort of reconnect our understanding of the past, to maybe think through how this affects our future.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Another question here from Justin. Do you think there should be a stronger emphasis on qualitative methods to understand the psychedelic experience while also digging deeper into its history to further inform therapy?
A short answer, yes. But, I mean, again, I'm not trained clinically, so I don't have a deep appreciation for sort of how this works in a clinical context. I don't know the logistics of what it's like to ask your patient to write down what they think about all of the things. What does that mean in terms of hours when you should be treating someone? I don't know. However, I can say from my perspective as a humanities trained person, the files that are most intriguing to us have been where therapists, and I'll use that frame very widely. So some are psychiatrists, some are social workers, there's a variety, some are religious figures who are very enthusiastic and passionate about the role that psychedelics might play in the broadest sense of healing. One of the things that really struck me is just the degree to which they want to engage in a kind of empathetic relationship. And to do that requires deeply listening to people. So, for example, rather than asking someone else to report on this, or maybe something more quantitative, they ask people to write an autobiography. Then they talk to them through the experience. Some people don't want to talk during the experience, so that's hit or miss depending on the individual. And then everyone who goes through the trials at Hollywood Hospital and at the Weyburn experiments and many of the Saskatchewan-based ones, all of the people were asked to write at their leisure, but they were still part of the experiment. They hadn't gone home yet. They were asked to write about what the experience meant to them. And then they were invited to sit with usually the psychiatrist, but not always, but somebody who was paid to sit and talk through that experience, which is very different, I think, from at least my experience with modern medical interactions today. You usually get about 10 minutes. Maybe if you have something really seriously going on, you might get to talk to a specialist for a little bit longer. But our system is not really designed for that kind of long, and maybe not an answer. Maybe it's just a reflection. And this is where psychotherapy and psychiatry were sort of meeting a little bit as well. But I think those qualitative pieces is where there's real kind of gold, there's real insight, and there's real perspective. And it's not just one-sided. It's not just the subject or patient gaining insight, but it's the therapists and the practitioners also gaining insight from their patients. And it became very apparent that there was a reciprocal relationship there. And I'm not, this isn't a criticism of today's therapists, but I wonder, it doesn't feel like we're thinking about things in those terms at the same way. So yes, I think that qualitative, that sort of empathy first model is really critical.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's a couple of questions here in regards to favorites. What is your favorite part about studying history? And then we have another one here that has to do with, I guess, favorites. It's who is the most memorable person or the favorite person that you've done research on or interviewed?
Oh, that's tough. I guess this is kind of cheesy, but I really love the idea of sort of, an intellectual time travel and trying to put myself in the shoes of someone from a different time period and imagine, see through their eyes or hear through their writing or whatnot, what was exciting to them, and sort of try to push away my assumptions and really sort of, I guess, deeply listen, or in this sense, sort of pay attention to what they choose to write, what they don't write, how they choose to memorialize this moment. And to me, it's really powerful. And so the stories that we tell each other about this is what really sort of captivates me. And what I love about this work is trying to think about how we feel comfortable justifying certain actions or certain reactions or justification for exclusion even. through the stories that we tell one another. That excites me. Memorable, oh gosh, so many memorable, incredible people I've met through this research. I was so fortunate that when I started this research in the early 2000s, a number of the psychedelic researchers from Saskatchewan who I was studying were still alive. And so I had an opportunity to interview a number of them or speak with them on the phone. I've had many, many memorable experiences. I guess maybe I'll share this one. It seems appropriate for today's talk. I worked on a documentary, and so I traveled around with a few documentarians who were with cameras and sound equipment and, lots of stuff. And there I was with my pencil, so I could sit in the kitchen quietly as they set up all their film equipment. And in one case, we were north of Toronto interviewing a guy named Neil Agnew, who was a psychologist who had participated in some of the psychedelic therapies in Saskatchewan in the late 1950s. And so all of the documentarians were men, and again, this is not, it just happened to be that they were all in the living room miking up Neil Agnew and getting ready to do this. And I was sitting in the kitchen making coffee with Mary Agnew, Neil's longtime wife. And she kind of leans in and started giggling. And she said, "Neil's not going to remember this. I was the one who helped him through when he was throwing up when he took too much peyote." And she was just sort of giggling and telling me all the stories I could tell you. She said, "I used to sit there and I didn't even think of it at the time. I feel embarrassed that I didn't capture that moment at that time. But it's always stuck with me as just such a beautiful insight, and a beautiful insight into her character as well, that she felt comfortable sharing that with me. And, meanwhile, they're doing an official documentary on her husband. That one stuck with me for sure. But there are incredible people who worked in this field.
That's so amazing. Usually the real juicy stuff comes out off camera, right?
Yeah. I think in that case it helped that I was, relatively, I was younger than the other people I was there with. I was the only other woman in the room. And so back to that sort of gossip thing, I think there was a bond or a connection there that might not have happened otherwise. And I wasn't standing there with a camera in her face,
Yeah, that makes a huge difference too, as well, right?
Yeah.
Anna has a question here, and it's in regards to psychedelic research happening at UBC. She's just wondering what kind of psychedelic research was happening at UBC in the 50s and 60s, if any.
Yeah, there's some really interesting stuff there. So I was recently pointed towards a thesis that was done by a woman named Carol Chertkow. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She was a graduate student in psychology who did really cool surveys and interviews with a variety of people who, it's kind of funny. She starts off saying she was going to interview people who identified as drug users, and then other people who weren't, but she couldn't find anybody who wasn't through her connections at UBC Psychology. So it ended up being a thesis about sort of, underground knowledge of safe practice and how to mitigate bad trips, or how to deal, so what kind of, unofficial information was being passed through different networks of drug users. It wasn't exclusive to psychedelics, but her main focus was on psychedelics. So what was interesting in her thesis is that she says things that maybe aren't going to surprise anyone here, but that drug users are actually quite knowledgeable about the drugs they take. They have all sorts of mechanisms and protocols in place to mitigate risk. And that it very much was quite different from what you would read in the mainstream news about, people jumping off of buildings because they didn't know that they were having a bad trip, where she was finding that people said, well, no, we don't really have bad trips because sometimes they're negative experiences, but we know how to handle that. We know how to talk to each other. We don't do it alone. And so there are always sort of narratives clashing with the sort of what was happening in the mainstream media. What was particularly interesting to me, though, was her supervisor was a guy named Jim Tyhurst, and he was, within a year of her finishing that thesis, he was appointed as one of the members of the federal government to look into an inquiry into the unsafe use of drugs, and he, I don't think, read her thesis. Came out very much in opposition to the LSD research, and he later was embroiled in a sex scandal of his own making, not related at all. So his testimony there was question thrown to his testimony. But there's a real split in Vancouver. Part of it is related to UBC and the research that was conducted there. And we saw this happening in Toronto as well. There was a deep split between researchers who felt motivated by the psychedelic opportunities or what psychedelics could do to transform psychiatry in particular, and those who were motivated more by marijuana research or other kinds of drug research. During this time, there was a real heyday of psychopharmacological research. And so there was sort of a competition about which kinds of methods, as well as which kinds of drugs would sort of rise over the top more quickly, or which ones might be more lucrative. And one of the division points within some of these places, Vancouver and Toronto being two key ones, is the way that researchers line up in support of different ways that we might think about taking drugs. So psychopharmaceutical drugs that you take for the rest of your life, for example, versus a psychedelic coupled with psychotherapeutic intervention. They represented very different sort of political positions in how we understand mental health and illness. And sometimes that clash also came to the fore. And we saw that at UBC, we saw it also in Toronto for sure. And Saskatchewan wasn't kind of on anybody's radar, so I think that clash didn't happen in the same way. Or it was small enough.
Super interesting. We have a couple of questions left here on Crowdcast, and this one's from Jordan. And it says, trying to do the best we can to nurture our kin, we often try to care for our loved ones with as few biases as we can. Are there techniques in psychedelic therapy that can help in carrying an unbiased mindset to our kin? Do you have any suggestions to help nurture healthy attitudes towards psychedelics for a young, developing mind?
Yeah, I am the mother of two children who are ages 7 and 9. So as far as I know, they haven't, mostly I think whatever I talk about will make them uncurious about it. So right now that's good audio too. But yeah, it's something that I think about. I don't have a good answer. What I will say, and this is not helpful perhaps at all, in the process of working through the letters between Aldous Huxley and Humphry Osmond, I really fell in love with those two characters in this history. And this is a topic that comes in and out of their conversations. Humphry Osmond has 2 small children. Aldous Huxley has, at this point in their relationship, he has a grown child. And it's interesting because they talk about it in relation to their own children, but they also talk about it in a more widespread way. And I guess they don't have any answers. And that's maybe the thing that was most refreshing to me, was that they didn't say, aha, this is how we should do it. They said, you know, we need to learn to be empathetic. We need to learn to listen. And even when we're talking about children. And I don't know, it's an 800-page book. I'm not suggesting you should sit down and flip through it for parenting advice. But in some ways, you know, it helps me sort of reconcile some of my own assumptions or some of the places where I felt I reached a limit where I was like, okay, I'm pretty open-minded about, oh no, but wait a second, when it comes to my children, I have a different perspective. And I learned a lot from reading through those letters as they tried to understand how to talk to a variety of people about some things that they felt. They were confused as to why some people held such apprehension towards psychedelics. And I think this, I don't know, it was a helpful way of thinking about dealing with some of those places where we get uncomfortable, which is not a very good answer. I apologize. I don't know.
No, it's definitely a tough question because, you know, there's, you know, how do you deal with it? I know, you know, in certain cultures, children are brought up in the, you know, with psychedelics. So it's, you know, in the Western world, of course, it's different, but it's like, how do we find a balance, right? And how do we, you know, bring it to the forefront? And
I've long held I'm sure I didn't make this up, but like a just say no attitude, so KNOW. And, you know, hiding things from children, whether it's psychedelics or talking to them about sex or sexuality or beer or whatever it might be, And we know this is the case not just with children, but even with adults. Criminalizing and not embracing a kind of harm reduction mentality or model often makes things worse. So, come back to me when my kids are teenagers, and I might be, singing a different song, but I hope that I can continue to embrace that kind of mentality that comes from a place of harm reduction and just say KNOW. So my kids feel confident making choices that they feel informed by, or confident being able to talk to me or somebody. I mean, it's probably not going to be me, but hopefully they have resources, and that's what we hope for.
Absolutely. We have a couple more questions here, and one is from Brad, and it says, "What is the vision for women in psychedelic therapy?" And then he says, "Matriarchy?" ?
That's always a vision, isn't it? No. I don't know. I'd want to talk to some of the women working in this field right now. I'm very fortunate to have read things from people like Monica Williams or Kathleen McLean or Julie Holland, Francois Borzat. I mean, there's some incredible women who are writing about their role in psychedelics and in clinical medicine, and I think I'd want to hear more from them and talk to them directly. I think it's really an exciting opportunity. I think there's an exciting moment here, as there is an opportunity for both renaissance and reconciliation, and sort of reconciling some of these imbalances from the past. And again, it may be a gender imbalance, but there are a variety of different imbalances that we have an opportunity to reconcile. And I think paying attention to people who are working on the front lines is important.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We have time for a couple of more questions here, and one of them has to do with the people who were young adults in the 60s taking LSD, etc., would be in their 80s and 90s now. Have you been able to interview people like that?
Yeah, so it's a super interesting question. I started doing interviews, I think it was 2002, and it was a different moment for doing interviews than what I would imagine it would be like today. Firstly, the psychiatrists, psychotherapists, social workers who I interviewed at that time were a little bit older yet, because many of them had been older when they started those experiments. So many of them died in their 90s, in the early 2000s. And it was interesting because some of them still felt very passionately committed to psychedelics will come again. You watch this space. And it was an interesting moment, and I'm perhaps naively, I didn't know what to do with that information at the time, or with those sort of passionate pleas. Finding people who were not officially connected to the trials was much more difficult. I did interview a few people who had come forward through an open call. They had been treated as patients. These were all men who had been treated for alcoholism. And I did interview some of them, but they did not want to go on record. They didn't want their names revealed. And it was very difficult to get. I couldn't get access to patient files, and I couldn't get anything that was, I didn't have anybody's names, and I wouldn't be allowed to follow up with names anyway. That's confidential. Today, it's a very different environment. So now over the last few years, I've probably had, 30, 40, 50 emails or phone calls from people who have volunteered to sort of have their testimony recorded, or have their perspectives included. And I think it's indicative of a real change in attitudes, not across the board. Things aren't totally into the psychedelic heyday yet. But I think there is a softening of perspectives, or people who've come to me and said, my children will never understand why I did this, but I'd like to share with you my story. And I didn't take LSD at Woodstock. They'll usually start by saying, or I didn't take it at a party. There are often those kinds of stories where people sort of want to get it on the record, I think, or they think that as a historian, I've got the historical record in my back pocket. But they want to sort of justify or validate their participation as something that they felt was positive, ethical even. And it suggests to me that there's a desire to sort of realign that past, that there's a desire to sort of change the story, change the tune, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if people are willing to talk today, it's a much different culture for people revealing their stories or being willing to talk more openly.
Absolutely. So out of all of the research that you've done, what would you say is the most surprising finding that you've come across?
I guess in some ways, like, I don't know how many people have like sat in like cold archives and dug through papers, and you spend all day there and you wonder about your own existence or why you're doing it or whether you're doing anything that's valuable at all. And then that day when you find like Humphry Osmond's actual handwritten, like coming up with the word psychedelic, that was a pretty big moment. I felt pretty excited. Yeah, I mean, and there's lots of wonderful little gems of stories and anecdotes and insights. I've wept in the archives coming across, people's very genuine stories about, what psychedelics have meant to them, how they've changed their lives, how it allowed them to reconcile relationships or, make amends. Even all of the interviews that I did with patients ended in tears. I shouldn't say ended in tears. At some point there were tears. There's so many moving moments in this history, and many of them are not captured in that quantitative sense, as somebody else had asked about. They're really only captured in that qualitative moment or in that personal moment. And I think that speaks to the broader themes here about the way that we think about emotional caretaking, whether it's the way we pay attention to that and how we tell these histories, or the way we pay attention to it in a clinical context. The emotional stories that come with psychedelics are really powerful. And I hope that we can hang on to that as we move forward.
Absolutely. So you've done so much already, Erika. What can we look forward to seeing from you in the near future here?
A nap. No. I've got a couple of new projects on the go that all relate to psychedelics in some ways. So I don't know which one's going to land or where it's going to go. I've been working on the history of Hollywood Hospital, picking away at those papers for a while now. But I'm also really curious about, I would also really like to think about where historians or where this sort of the power of history or history storytelling, how that might connect with the current psychedelic renaissance. And I have, committed no words to paper on that. But I'm really sort of motivated to think about what historians, myself and others, I mean, there's a whole generation of people who are asking really interesting, critical questions about how we might think differently about this past to align it with a different kind of future. And I think there's real fertile ground there, really interesting work being done. So I'd love to host a conference and bring a bunch of sort of psychedelic humanists together to think about some of these questions in a big context.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This has been so informative. Do you have any final words that you'd like to leave everyone with today?
Just to thank you all so much for listening. And I do encourage you to reach out if you have any questions now or later or anytime. I'm really excited to hear from everyone. Thanks so much for hosting this.
Thanks so much for being here with us, Erika.
Thank you.
So I'd like to take this time to thank those that have helped make this webinar series possible. Thank you again to our wonderful guest, Erika Dyck. Thank you to our amazing sponsors. Thank you to the MAPS Canada volunteers who are assisting with this event behind the scenes. And very importantly, thank you to all of you for being here to support this series, these speakers, and this important research. So up and coming, our next episode will be on July 14th with Zoe Helene. Make sure and submit your questions in advance. And our full lineup can always be viewed on the webpage at mapscanada.org/webinar. We have 7 episodes remaining. So if you haven't purchased the series and would like to, you're able to up until the end of August, and you can log in and watch all of the videos right from the beginning. So thank you again for attending. Thank you again, Erika. And we look forward to seeing everyone on the next episode. Bye for now.